The question of what causes wars is often the subject of much debate, be it World War II, the Napoleonic Wars, or the American Civil War, to name a few. These wars often have clear causes. For World War II, it was Hitler. For the Napoleonic Wars, it was, well, Napoleon. And for the American Civil War, it was Johnny Reb himself. Though the causes of wars aren't always so straightforward. World War I is such a war and has been a hotly contested question since the first month of the war, with the release of the colored books, each blaming the other side. Today the debate has changed. Instead of focusing on which nation or individual caused the war, it is accepted among most historians that no one in Europe actually wanted a war, as exemplified by the telegrams between Tsar Nicholas II and Kaiser Wilhelm II. Forcing historians to investigate the prevailing ideas of the 19th century to find the cause. For this video, I'll be discussing and providing some background to these ideas with the help of Maine, militarism, alliances, imperialism, and finally nationalism. Each contributed to the meat grinder that was World War I, a war so great it was famously dubbed the war to end all wars. The idea that militarism isn't a new idea. In fact, forms of it can be observed in societies such as Rome or Sparta, where service in the military was a civic duty, a duty that would gain you respect. This, however, fundamentally changed following the development of a national consciousness brought upon by Napoleon. Duty to the state was no longer a question of class but of citizen, and the extent of which you were willing to give up your life to the state. Prussia, who would go on to form a united German empire, would usher this new era of militarism, with the massed but well-trained army being a unique idea of Prussia when it was first developed in the later half of the 18th century. This form of militarism would begin to be picked up by most of Europe. By the end of the 19th century, the total European military spending had risen exponentially. The rise of newspapers, such as the British Daily Mail, which would reach a readership of 1 million by 1896, would serve to connect citizens who were living in increasingly democratic societies to become intimate with the affairs of the state. Perhaps the greatest example of this connection is the Anglo-German naval race. The Anglo-German naval race, though much too complicated to explain full in this video, greatly contributed to the German and British antagonism leading to the First World War. What began as an attempt by the German Naval Office to limit Britain's long-held superiority at the sea, quickly devolved into a crisis that neither party truly wanted. Britain's goal of stopping the German buildup and the German attempt at decrowning Britain as the masters of the sea held contrary to each other, though each spent several years attempting to negotiate each other down, with the last occurring in the spring of 1914, mere months before they found each other at the end of a rifle. To better illustrate the effects of the naval race in Britain, the Royal Navy saw an increase of funding in the range of 70% from 1907 to 1914, and with added pressure from both the public and the press, the otherwise hesitant Liberal government was forced to order 8 dreadnoughts in 1909, following the "We Want 8 and We Won't Wait" campaign led by the press and public alike. Of course, it would be silly to suggest that the Anglo-German race directly led to the war, but it should be noted that the dark cloud that was cast over the race, with the British public not only passively wanting an increase of naval spending to counter perceived German aggression, but vehemently demanded it. It should also be noted the greatest irony of the intense arms race. The Royal Navy and the Kaiserliche Marine only met once during World War I at the inconclusive Battle of Jutland. The Congress of Vienna, which came after the fall of Napoleon, changed European alliances forever. Before the Congress system, alliances were often thought as means to an end, and often shifted as circumstances changed. Indeed, Britain, who famously lavished in their splendid isolation, were unable to escape the clutches of the changing system, who were constantly bound to Belgium through their guarantee of Belgian independence, as per the London Treaty of 1839, and the reluctant entry in the Crimean War. Although the continent of Europe oversaw a century of peace, it wasn't without challenges. Perhaps the biggest challenge for it was the reorganizing of Europe upon the Italian and German unifications. The European alliance system post-1871 would see the major European powers split the continent between the Triple Alliance and the Entente. Though at first the autocratic German and Russian empires found themselves as natural allies, the German refusal to renew the Russo-German Reinsurance Treaty of 1887 gathered them into France's arms, who despite being a republic, embraced its new autocratic friend in 1893. The British too, though at first open to a German alliance, were ultimately rejected by the Germans when they suggested first the partition of the Ottoman Empire, then of Morocco. This, alongside the naval race, gravitated them towards France in 1902, and thus the Triple Entente was informally established. The dual alliance between Austria-Hungary and Germany was very likely the most shocking alliance of the 19th century, as just over 10 years before, they had been engulfed in a war of dominance within the proposed German Empire. A closer look, however, shows the alliance to be a logical reaction to the shifting European balance of power. Both Austria and Germany found themselves diplomatically isolated, with Austria losing Russian support during the 1866 crisis, and Russia's renewed interests in the Balkans forced Austria to enter an alliance with the old adversary. The Italian entrance into what would become the Triple Alliance was much more complicated, with the Austrian and Italian foreign policies often contradicting themselves. So why then did Italy join Austria and Germany in 1881? Above all, they feared French interests in the Italian peninsula. However, by 1902, Italy had signed a secret agreement with France with the promise of a non-intervention should France be forced into a defensive war. In seeing the formation of these alliances and the fracturing of the continent, it's clear that the formation of Germany and Italy, as well as the increased distrust of the major powers, forced them into two camps who found themselves increasingly at odds with one another and unable or unwilling to come to a productive agreement. Throughout researching this video, one event seemed to appear time after time, the Agadir Crisis of 1911. To explain why, we have to go back a few decades to 1885, when the major European powers all met to determine the fate of Africa. Called by the architect of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, the Berlin Conference is often seen as the beginning of the scramble for Africa, or at least the counterpart of it, by laying the political foundations for the unprecedented conquest of Africa. The decades that followed the conference would see Africa carved up like a cake, which though mostly peaceful, led to several close calls. This leads us to the first Moroccan crisis. Germany's prestige had been declining and she was finding herself isolated, with only Austria by her side. Germany needed a way to not only save her prestige, but to grow her overseas empire. In January 1906, Germany got that chance. Germany felt that it had not been consulted on the future of Morocco, who was quickly falling to French influence. So as an attempt to save both German prestige and regain some influence over the valuable kingdom, Kaiser Wilhelm II traveled to Morocco to reaffirm Moroccan independence. Although the resulting crisis did affirm their independence, the crisis showed just how united France and Britain were, and how lonely Germany really was, as Austria couldn't even muster an adequate defense for their ally. Germany would get another chance to prove her worth on a global scale in 1911. In early 1911, French troops entered Morocco, in violation of the Treaty of Algiers, which gave the German public, press, and government the opportunity they were looking for. Sending a gunboat on July 1st under the guise of protecting German firms. Many European powers were shocked at the aggressive German response, particularly France and Britain. Before we continue, it's worth taking a look at the German and French objectives. Why were the French so keen on sending troops to Morocco, despite it going against the Treaty of Algiers? And what were the German demands, their endgame? To answer the French objectives, one must understand the importance that North Africa laid to them. Starting in the 1830 conquest of Algeria, the French perspective of North Africa was not one of imperialist endeavor or colonial program, but as an extension of French proper. This too explains the French interests in the 1881 annexation of Tunisia. So if we can understand the French position as expanding the natural borders, what objective did the Germans bring forth? To be entirely truthful, the Germans had no real objective in the crisis, or at least not one directly involving Morocco. Although there were German companies pressuring the Kaiser to annex southern Morocco, their objectives remained unclear. What remains clear, however, is the German Empire did indeed intend to restore their prestige, just as they had attempted during the first Moroccan crisis, by not allowing French annexation of Morocco until the Germans had gained something, anything, of their own. And so that leads us to the original question I posed. Why had I seen the Agadir crisis again and again during my research? Well, despite the warnings of war, both parties went home content. France was able to annex Morocco without any more heat, and the German Empire gained land in the French Congo. So why then is this crisis in this video? Despite Germany getting what it wanted, some prestige back, and disallowing France to annex Morocco without some compensation, it went home without friends, knowing that Britain and France were closer than ever. Another note of importance is how the press and the public reacted to the crisis. Both the French, British, and German press were in a frenzy despite government attempts to control the information of the crisis, a reaction that would further the flames of war. Most importantly for this video though, is the crisis was not much different than any other imperialist crisis that followed similar periods of intense flare-up before dying down by an agreement, creating a troubling indifference to the many crises that became almost commonplace until the conclusion of the July crisis in 1914. By the eve of the First World War, the liberal nationalism that had encouraged the Italian and German unifications and encouraged widespread social services, such as schools, had morphed into an exclusionary ideology that relied on othering. This new nationalism, which took on many different forms, manifested itself throughout Europe, especially after 1870. The two regions that relate greatest to the First World War, however, are the nationalisms that grew within Alsace and Lorraine in relation to the French and German nationalism, and more intimately, the nationalism that grew in the Balkans, particularly in the Serbo-Croatian dominated regions. The aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War singled out one of the biggest shifts in European political affairs. The first and most obvious shift was the change of the balance of power upon German unification that we touched upon earlier, but the other major shift was the solidification of the French and German rivalry, of which the French loss of Alsace and Lorraine to the Germans played a defining role in. The French Third Republic, which formed in the aftermath of the French defeat, centered much of its nationalist outlook towards the revanchist goal of reclaiming its lost provinces. This was largely achieved through the reformation of the public school, particularly the study of history, which was quickly professionalized with close ties to the natural republican government. This led to a large section of French society, particularly young children who would eventually fight in the First World War, to view the Germans as French-hating who waged a war so unjustly against France as to steal an integral French territory. Although this view of Alsace and Lorraine being of integral French territory could be debated, the fact still stands. For France and its nationalists, Alsace and Lorraine became the justification for all new anti-German sentiment, whether in the far-off colonies or in the creation of a new entente. The revanchist desire for the lost provinces remained in the minds of all French nationalists. Moving away from France, the Balkans proposed its own set of unique problems that would eventually coincide with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Beginning with the 1878 Berlin Conference, where Austria was given permission to occupy the previous Ottoman territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Some 30 years later, and still under Austrian occupation, though nominally under Ottoman rule, the Austrians, fearful of the increasingly nationalistic Turkish reformers, the Austrians began to devise plans to officially annex the province. When on October 5th, Austria officially proclaimed the annexation, Europe was, as had become tradition, whipped into a frenzy. Two states in particular were greatly bothered by this annexation. First was the Russians, who felt tricked into giving permission of the annexation by both the Austrians and forced by the Germans, and Serbia, who felt the majority Serbian lands, of which they considered the Bosniaks and Croatians, who were a part of, had been wrongly stripped of their rights to. These feelings of resentment by both Serbia and Russia meant that a renewed crisis in the Balkans between Austria and Serbia would disallow Russia to back down as it had during the Bosnian crisis. This lack of diplomatic flexibility meant that, when on June 28th, when a young Serbian nationalist with disputed ties to Serbia assassinated the heir to the Austrian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, meant that unlike before, a peaceful end to the crisis no longer seemed possible.